Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Julie Babin, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Indian Ocean World Center at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. I am joined today by Dr. Manikarnika Dutta. Dr. Dutta is a historian of colonialism and medicine with a special focus on the British Empire in South Asia. She holds a Master in Modern History from University of Calcutta and an MSc in History of Science, Medicine and Technology, funded by a Wellcome Trust Master Studentship of the University of Oxford. Her doctorate research was a part of the Wellcome Trust funded project entitled From Sail to Steam, Health, Medicine, and the Victorian Navy. It examined the co-emergence of British maritime and tropical hygiene and the importance of sanitary reform for empire building. Dr. Dutta's research until now has produced 3 peer-reviewed publications and has won the Taniguchi Medal in 2018, as well as the William Bynum Essay Prize in 2021. Dr. Dutta's research examines the relationship among colonialism, medicine, and public health and race in colonial India. She received the Royal Historical Society Early Career Fellowship Grant in 2021 to develop her doctoral thesis into a monograph which explores the health and welfare of European seamen in British naval and merchant fleets in the Indian Ocean, both on board ships and in major Indian port cities. In doing so, it expands the historical understanding of key role of mobile British subaltern subjects in shaping British imperialism and tropical and maritime hygiene in the 19th century. Currently, Dr. Dutta is working as a research associate in the Invisible Crisis, Neglected History, Malaria in Asian 19th Century to Present project, where she's developing a collaborative output on the cooperation between the British colonial state in malaria research and eradication in the 20th century India. Today, we are going to discuss her work on maritime health and hygiene, health and welfare of European seamen in Indian port cities that include her paper entitled Cholera, British Seamen and Maritime Anxieties in Calcutta in 1930s to 1990s that was published by Cambridge University Press. This paper examined how the British Naval Authority ships and surgeon and the medical and municipal authority in Calcutta sailor town sought to improve maritime health and hygiene to prevent the spread of cholera among British seamen. All the details about Dr. Dutta's papers will be available on the description of this podcast. So with further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Dutta to the IOW podcast. And we are very thrilled to have you here with us today and excited to begin our discussion with you. So to start us off, could you explain how you became interested in social history of medicine?
Thank you so much, Julie, for this wonderful introduction, and I'm really happy to be a part of this wonderful podcast series. So as you mentioned, so I'm particularly interested in the social histories of medicine, more broadly conceived in its relation to the histories of empire and colonialism. So, and it's this interconnectivity, this connected and the transnational histories of the local with the global. It's something that really fascinates me, in the sense the way the empire and as well as the other global networks were integral to the shaping of the post-colonial societies. And what I really attempt to show in my research, that it's really important to kind of go beyond the binaries, such as the co-periphery model, or be it the nation and the empire, or the West and the traditional, or even the colonial and the metropole model, towards a more continuum history rather than like just showcasing it as a rupture. Now, and I'm really passionate about public health histories. So I've worked on the histories of Western medicine in the British Empire, and I'm really keen and interested in the colonial and global histories of disease, health, and hygiene. And so in sum, I have a broad range of interests broadly under the umbrella of the history of the modern Western medicine, with additional niche specialism in colonial health and hygiene medicine, and the movement of knowledge, people transnationally. And I'm kind of really interested in the flows and circulation of ideas, knowledge production, and institutions across these uneven terrain. So my research so far has examined the history of public health, medicine, and race, and mobility in the British Empire. And in doing so, I've engaged with methods from imperial and colonial histories and the histories of public health and medicine, and as well as social histories to analyze the co-emergence of tropical maritime hygiene and the importance of sanitary reform in empire building. And as you said, that I'm currently trying to write my monograph, which is again based on my DPhil research, which kind of explores how British imperialism took shape in the tropical waters and coast through the scientific understanding of tropical climate and intervention in maritime tropical hygiene. So my work kind of mostly focuses on the key role of the health and welfare of the European seamen in British naval and the merchant fleet, as you pointed out, both on the board ships and in the Indian port cities. And I have studied Bengal and Calcutta as a case study, and Calcutta as a port city. And in doing so, my research studies the making of the British imperial politics through maritime health intervention in the tropics and through the scientific understanding of tropical climate and experiments with the tropical hygiene. So in my research, I show how the development of maritime hygiene through the 19th century was entangled with certain ideas of the tropics and the tropical hygiene, the sanitary environment of lived spaces, race, and imperialism. Now, the resulting hygienic and sanitary innovations were thus product not only of imperial medicine, but also transnational connection of people, places, and ideas. Something that is very integral to my research framework. Now, the aim of the study is twofolded. So first is to see how and to what extent maritime medicine helped to shape the understanding of health and hygiene in the tropics. So when it comes to the agency of the European troops and military surgeons in shaping public health in British India, this is something that has generated like quite a few historical works. But when it comes to the impact of European seamen and maritime medicine, there is very little still that is has been written or known. And secondly is to expand our current understanding of imperial medicine in the British colony through a study of mobile British subjects and health policies across various imperial sites. And in my research, it argues that seamen's health in transit and in imperial ports cities was instrumental in the development of tropical hygiene and sanitary reform as an indispensable mechanism for empire building, as I say. So it's through the studying of these go-betweeners who link the metropole, that is Britain, and the periphery, which is the colonies, and the role of imperialism and philanthropy in shaping public health, that it can broaden our understanding of how the political, medical, and civilian personnel of the British Empire governed the poor and the vulnerable white imperial subjects.
So thank you, Dr. Dutta. Could you tell us more, why were the sailors of particular concern to colonial policymakers? And why were their moral called into question more regularly than, say, soldiers? Also, why are they more connected with disease like cholera?
Thank you, Julie, for that question. So the seamen had an important role in pushing Britain's imperial frontiers. And apart from the kind of role that obviously was played by the army, so they defended the homeland, the overseas territories from the invasion of the rival empire, secured trade routes, and obviously, and again, facilitated trade and commerce. So when it comes to the sailors, imagined by the British as exceptionally undisciplined lot, if I could say so, since the Middle Ages, the seamen were kind of visualized as this problematic category of people. They had this image where their reputation of being like ruthless, often violent, promiscuous, and even dysphomaniac. That so it's their wild and it's this non-committal character that was so entrenched in popular imagination, and in fact even in maritime fictional and non-fictional works that kind of portrayed them as habitual troublemakers. And so they were kind of widely considered to be this dangerous, immoral, and in fact, their activities were seen to have jeopardized not only their health and careers, but also their families and the places they visited or inhabited. And it's this this entire understanding of who these sailors were and their image and their health connection is something that really kind of intrigued me, and I really wanted to know their story. So that's so when I was kind of trying to understand their health condition and what are the diseases that they suffered from, I also felt that it kind of, that's why I kind of talk about the welfare of the seamen, trying to understand like their well-being sort of. So it's this, like the critical attitudes towards the seamen arguably it started, in fact, to change towards the late 18th century. As as the naval authorities or even the Christian missionaries, the authors, the playwrights, they kind of sought to kind of project them as valiant founders of Britain's maritime empire. So now they were kind of portrayed simultaneously as like as some as men full of masculine aggression, but again needing severe regulation at the same point. But when I'm talking about the European seamen in Indian port cities, this is again quite interesting because they were also again seen as the disreputable section of the European settlers in India, and and also as a group of highly visible white subalterns whose action kind of threatened to dismantle this edifice of racial ideological superiority that was kind of built by the colonial state. So it's their reckless behavior of these seamen kind of that brought them closer to the uncivilized natives in the eyes of the state. So now coming to the second part of your question as to why cholera, or like as to why diseases like cholera. Now it's important to understand that cholera arguably was which was spread by transmission through water, like as in through ships or the surface, that is road, like as in the different modes of transport, along with public gatherings as such as markets, fairs, or even pilgrimage sites. Something that has been pointed out by historians like David Arnold. Now, also advocates of contagion theory had seen it spread across the vast oceans as evidence of its transmissibility. Now, it's important again to kind of remember that in the 1830s or 40s or the 50s, there was little kind of comparatively little concern with this, the connection between cholera being a shipborne infection. But again, at the same time, the expansion of the steam navigation had made it possible for ships to reach their destination more quickly than ever before. So, so it's this entire kind of transition from sail to steam really helped diseases now to kind of travel at a much faster pace. In fact, like the steam power also enabled the construction of larger and stronger vessels made of iron, which were now capable of carrying more people, which kind of, again, the spreading more germs, if I could say so, something that again has been pointed out by Mark Harrison. So it was during the fourth wave of the cholera epidemic, that is in 1865, that cholera approached Europe for the first time by sea instead of land routes. And that was in the aftermath of an epidemic during the Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca. And following that year, that is in 1866, which during the Third International Scientific Conference, which was held, in fact, in Constantinople, that kind of discussed how infected, passengers, pilgrims, and of course the seamen, as in how they kind of carried the cholera to the Egyptian and the Mediterranean ports, and subsequently to Europe. So now, so now, if you could say so, that the seamen's or the immigrants, laborers as well, increasing mobility that will kind of intensify the threat of the global disease dispersion, thus making their health a global concern. So coming to your question as to why the connection between the seamen and cholera. So this is the thing that I kind of talk about in my research, that how seamen were increasingly recognized and seen as potential carriers of diseases such as epidemic cholera, or even for that matter, plague and yellow fever later on.
Thank you very much for your answer. So also one of the topic of particular interest on this show is climate and also climatic crisis. So keeping this in mind, could you tell us more about the connection between cholera and its association with Bengal? More specifically, how does the environment of Bengal play in your analysis, and how did the differences in Indian and European climate influence contemporary medical thinking and colonial policy?
Again, thanks, Julie, for that question. And so when we're talking about cholera, so cholera was essentialized as an Indian disease. I'll expand on that more later. So the first cholera epidemic, was found to be kind of happening first in Joshore, in Bengal in the August of 1817. And it's from there that it kind of spread to the other parts of Bengal and later India and then the rest of the world. In fact, the waves of the cholera that engulfed India between 1817 and 1821 is kind of said to be a turning point in the history of subcontinent, by Professor Mark Harrison. And again, David Arnold has pointed out that few diseases in the 19th century appeared to be as violently destructive as epidemic cholera. So kind of taking these very two important statements in mind, so just to understand cholera. So as a term, cholera was already present for long. It wasn't something that just happened in 1817. In fact, historians have already written that very much even in the 18th century, cholera kind of struck even the European troops for that matter. So it wasn't something that was completely new to Bengal. But of course, the strength and the spread of the disease was obviously something that was new, in the sense that it kind of really engulfed, if I could say, that it didn't even leave one continent missing. But in fact, the term cholera, according to the Hippocratic understanding of health, which kind of emphasize the necessary balance among the four humors, which is kind of namely blood, phlegm, and the black bile and the yellow bile. So it was this discharge of the excess of the yellow bile, which is kind of called as cholera, that kind of caused cholera, or the cholera morbus that was already known in the West. So the form of cholera that was known to the Europeans was kind of associated more like something like diarrhea. So it was not usually that fatal. But this new cholera, as they understood, was more malignant and more pervasive than the old disease. And now coming back to your question is that how cholera was understood and kind of essentialized as a Bengali disease. That's something that I kind of mentioned. That so the new cholera was kind of considered to be Asian, Indian, and particularly Bengali in its ways. In fact, the medical personnel, they kind of mentioned this word Asiatic cholera. So kind of to demarcate between the cholera morbus, something that was already known to the West, and what was happening in Bengal. And it was this arbitrary and the erratic nature of the disease that kind of made it more alarming. So this is something that, in fact, in several medical reports, that it was kind of noted that the epidemic did not really appear to follow any obvious or rational line of progression. So there were times when, for example, one village was struck by the epidemic, and in fact, it kind of travels from one village to the other, as in the neighboring villages, and suddenly it kind of disappears one day, all of a sudden. and it doesn't kind of resurface for a few months, and again it comes back. So it was this mystifying nature, as Arnold puts it, and this unpredictability that was kind of made it more perplexing and the more mystifying for the Europeans, for the British people. Now, it was widely believed that this disease originated in the swamps of the delta Bengal. So, as I said, that it was in August 1817 in Joshore in the Ganges Delta that was struck by cholera, where the epidemic seems to have originated. Kind of, it was from there that it moved to the other parts of India, and later to, in fact, China, Japan. And the second pandemic, in fact, for that matter, in 1829, proved to be more severe, and it kind of advanced to Europe. And between 1830, that was in between 1830 and 32, and it kind of crossed Atlantic to reach like the States by 1832, and again by 1840s it was there in Central Africa. So what I mean to say is that by the end of 1850s, it was almost there in every corner of the world. Now, in European imagination, this deadly disease, as they kind of called it, it was a deadly beast from the East, a uniquely Indian, like inherently and uniquely Indian disease, and was kind of wholly distinct. Now, the two men who were largely responsible for conceptualizing cholera as an Asiatic disease were physicians John Macpherson and Charles McNamara. So the two works that I would like to mention here are by Macpherson. He kind of wrote the Annals of Cholera from the earlier times to 1817. That was published in the 1870s, early 1870s. And again, by McNamara, again, publishing in, I think, his work, I think, came out in 1876, and he wrote the treatise, The History of Asiatic Cholera. So in both these work that they kind of agreed upon, and they kind of really agreed upon, both of them, was that cholera being internally Asian, while neither of them could actually find any proof for that matter, like as in the existence of cholera in ancient India or something. But nevertheless, they did kind of mention that India was kind of believed to be logically unique, and something that cholera was essentially a Bengali disease. And in their work, the way they kind of spoke about cholera, wrote about Bengal, and what is and how their connection between the climatic conditions in Bengal and the natural habitation of Bengal, it kind of almost kind of stigmatized Bengal, because there was, again, this, it's important to kind of also note that there was this connection between filth being considered as the main cause of cholera, right? So it's just all of this taking together, and Macaulay, in fact, he kind of his portrait of Bengal being as the epitome of filth, as he said, and barbarity, was kind of in fact to large extent inspired by cholera epidemic. So as Arnold again has pointed out, that cholera was highly a political disease, and an epidemic that was not only accidentally Indian, but rather essentially Indian. And it kind of illustrates how the space was realistically colonized under the British Raj. So there was this common fear, the European fear of this extreme hot and humid Indian climate, that not only added to their apprehensions, but also to their vulnerability, and also, in fact, was in a way instrumental in the etiology of cholera being seen as an Indian epidemic. So it's just not the fear of hot and humid climate, but the soil, the dirt, the filth, as well as the religious pilgrimage, everything taken together kind of, like essentialized cholera as being seen as an Indian disease.
Thank you, Dr. Dutta. For our last question today for you, you mentioned several times in your research that colonial anxiety regarding maritime space to British maritime hygiene And we were wondering if you could discuss this connection between drunkenness and cholera further. Were they two separate problems that provoke similar responses, or did the colonial authorities see a causal relationship between one and the other?
So yes, this connection between cholera and drunkenness is something that really kind of got me interested in the very first couple of years of my research. So, something that I mentioned in the first section of this podcast, where I kind of mentioned that how sailors were seen as being promiscuous, as drunken sailors. So even in when these European seamen, when they were visiting Calcutta, and their favorite haunt was the Flag Street, which was in an area in Calcutta known as the Lal Bazaar. In fact, this place is still very much there, and it's very close to my home, in fact. So this place was kind of full of taverns, and it was maintained both by Indians as well as Europeans, and in fact Europeans from Italy, Spain, or Portugal. The captains of the ships, who would often visit the gambling and the drinking dens, for that matter, sometimes accompanied by police constables, in fact, try to kind of retrieve the sailors in time for their outward journey. So as to kind of answer what was the connection between drunkenness and cholera in the in Calcutta port city. So in fact, there was this large outcry, kind of, and there was a lot of concern against the grog shops and the danger, that the kind of that kind of dangerous effects that they had on British soldiers and sailors. It was considered that, like the spirit that was kind of sold there was like particularly bad and very cheap, and because it was very cheap, obviously, the sailors kind of really indulged in them. In fact, it's noted that, like many of their medals were robbed, and obviously several of them died of these drinks. So just before I kind of expand on this, so I just would like to say that 76% of the cholera victims in Calcutta at this point in 1860s were the floating population, and most of them were sailors. So this disease, suffering, and mortality among seamen, which were principally obviously associated with poor eating habits, stale, contaminated air, or like in general, the unhealthy climatic conditions, something that we were mentioning before. But apart from that, it was also drunkenness and obviously their visits to the local prostitutes. So when we're talking about drunkenness, I would like to kind of really talk about adulterated liquor. So it was just not mere drunkenness that kind of caused cholera. So it was rather the consumption of adulterated liquor. So the story that we get here was that how the poisonous extract of Cocculus indicus, which was in fact popularly known as the black extract, was mixed with malt liquors to increase the level of intoxication as a economized production cost, perhaps. So like even a small amount of lead, in fact, acted as a small poison. So the people who kind of responsible for this adulteration were not only seen as frauds, but as well as murderers by many of these Europeans writing about this adulterated liquor sale. Now, the liquor shops also kind of employed, to kind of attract these European seamen. They kind of employed abandoned women as prostitutes, kind of under the cover of domestic servitude, obviously. Now, these women went into the piers and kind of lured sailors into their establishment. So in fact, many of these shops kind of sold this liquor exclusively for sailors, named Sailor Jack or Tom's Brandy, prepared this from a strong arak mixed with poisonous juice of datura, the juices of tobacco, chilies, and opium. So it was this mixture of beer, water, vinegar, soap, nuts, and so on, and being sold at a very low price that really kind of attracted the sailors. So some colonial officials kind of reported a conspiracy by the deceitful and the cruel, and the danger of natives to kind of get this innocent in quotes, I would say, white sailors drunk and stealing their possessions. So in fact, I would like to mention someone called A.L. Michel, who was a seaman's chaplain. He kind of gave this vivid description on how crims kind of operated in Indian port cities and how basically how the crimping system in Calcutta worked, and where crims, they formed gangs. They also kind of call themselves runners, and he accused them of being harpies in kind of enticing sailors to consume drugged liquor. These white sailors were kind of seen as these unfortunate victims, in the hands of the conspirators, who were these Indian crims. So all this kind of led to a concern over the quality of liquor being sold at the grog shops, and that were kind of being available to the European sailors. In fact, the situation was such, as Norman Sheffers, he kind of points out, that the adulterated liquor was so difficult. So it was this unadulterated liquor that was so difficult to obtain that a sober man, so by sober man he means a British sailor, that could hardly even get a drink of proper beer. So in many of these cases, these sailors who were kind of were found to suffer from cholera after consuming this poisonous liquor purchased from these local grog shops, that kind of instigated mortality among the seamen, and thus it was found that mortality among the European seamen was comparatively much higher than the rest of the European population.
Thank you, Dr. Dutta. I was curious if you had any thoughts to conclude our time together today.
So yes, thank you, Julie. And I must say that I really enjoyed today's podcast, and thank you for your questions. They were really interesting. And in fact, while I was I was speaking about this topic again, because I kind of really researched on it, and I submitted my thesis back in 2019. And since then, I've been kind of trying to write my book out of it. And it really helped me kind of to think about some of the questions that kind of came into my mind while I was speaking to you today. And just to conclude, perhaps I would just like to say that, for my ongoing research and also for my future projects, in fact, something that I would really like to reflect and address is to the question of this legacies of imperialism and colonialism in a post-colonial world. As to also kind of reflect on how social and health inequalities are still determined by race and ethnicity. For example, the question, to kind of question and reflect on how entangled histories of tropical medicine, public health, and colonialism continue to have social, political, cultural, and economic relevance to global health, if I could say so. So to that kind of understand and reflect on what is colonial about global health. So I would just like to conclude by saying that it's really important for historians to kind of question and reflect on how histories kind of really set the scene for essential discussions about the present and as well as the future of the healthcare and healthcare policies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dutta, for discussing your work and your projects. This was really fascinating, and I think we are all looking forward reading your monograph when it will be ready. For our auditors today, all the links of the mentioned papers will be added in the description of this podcast. To conclude, I would also like to thank Samuel Riemann for organizing and editing this podcast. Thanks to all the listeners, wherever you are, for downloading or streaming this podcast. Once again, my name is Julie Babin, and you have been listening to the Indian Ocean World Podcast.
We would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The Indian Ocean World podcast is produced under the SSHRC-funded partnership Appraising Risk, Past and Present. The podcast runs in conjunction with the annual speaker series at the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill University, Montreal. Next Wednesday on the podcast, we will be speaking to Dr. Harriet Mercer of Cambridge University. The first speaker in the fall speaker series will be Professor Andrew Avaska at Concordia University on Wednesday, October 12th. Listeners in the Montreal area are cordially invited to attend and should contact the Centre for details.